Thank you very much, distinguished guests and friends and colleagues. I do thank you for the opportunity to present how we manage a hypersaline resource here in Utah, namely the Great Salt Lake. Next slide, please. Just by way of introduction, what I'd like to do is just briefly discuss the worldwide Artemia resources. We do believe, of course, that man-made resources are going to become more and more important in order to sustain the growth in marine aquaculture. That being said, with at least more than 90% of the commercial Artemia today still coming from natural resources, it remains really important that we manage those natural resources in a sustainable manner. Next slide. So we know that there are many anthropogenic influences on our resources. Some examples are the unregulated harvest, salinity increases, nutrient losses, and water shortages. Close to our home here in the USA, we have the example of Owens Lake, where water diversions for Los Angeles in 1913 already resulted in a dry lake bed by 1926. And we know that we see many of these issues worldwide, and frankly, we see them also on the Great Salt Lake here in Utah. Next slide, please. So the question begs how we tackle these multiple issues related to our endorheic lakes. And what I would like to do is give the example of how we've been working on these issues here on the Great Salt Lake. By no means do I mean to infer that example should be used in other natural resources. I do believe that every hypersaline system is unique. It has a unique set of circumstances, and it often needs a unique approach to sustainable management. But maybe the Great Salt Lake can serve maybe as an example, if you will, of how some of these issues could be tackled. Let me start with talking about sustainable harvest management here on Great Salt Lake. In the early 90s, there was truly an increased harvest pressure on the Great Salt Lake. There was really no formal program to manage the resource. There was not a lot of research being done with regard to the Artemia resource, and the industry was frankly becoming very concerned about overfishing of the resource. Next slide. So the industry then took the initiative, approached the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources with those concerns, and the division created the Great Salt Lake Ecosystem Project. It's a project that's tasked with managing the resource and studying the resource. The division also created a technical advisory group. It's a peer review committee that helps guide that research. And then the division actually increased the industry fees to harvest that resource, but then used those fees to work jointly with other research institutes to improve the research of the resource. Next slide. With that data, the state, and with the support of our industry, the state then created a sustainable management model. It's a model that's based on a modified stock recruitment curve, a modified Ricker curve, if you will, where we try to leave an optimal amount of cysts in the lake after the harvest in order to assure an optimal population growth in a subsequent season. That model takes into account many different factors, and it ultimately created a very sustainable management model that allows the industry to actually harvest the excess cysts above 21 cysts per liter. Next slide. As you can see in this graph, since we've implemented this model, what we've noticed is a decrease in the variability of the harvest and an increase in the actual dry equivalent harvest. And that has been, for us, an indication of the success of the management system. Next slide. So with management under control, it brings us to the questions of salinity and nutrient management. And salinity and nutrients are two main drivers for the Artemia population health here on Great Salt Lake. With a couple of decades now of research, what we can say is that the optimal salinity for the Artemia population on Great Salt Lake is between 120 and 160 ppt. That the lake is primarily nitrogen limited, although there is a co-limitation of nitrogen and phosphorus, and that the Great Salt Lake really has a significant excess capacity for assimilation of nutrients. Next slide. So with that research in mind, what we then know is that if we can keep the salinity within a safe range, higher than 120 ppt to avoid predation and problems with phytoplankton communities, lower than 160, 180 ppt, where we see significant population level declines because of physiological reasons primarily. If we can keep that salinity within that optimal range and we can have adequate nutrient loading into the lake, then we know today that we can keep that Artemia population at present levels, even with a highly reduced volume of Great Salt Lake. Next slide. So the question then begs, how do we manage that salinity? Well, on the Great Salt Lake, we're fortunate that we have a causeway that bisects the lake, that the major drainages into the lake are coming into the southern part of the lake, as shown on this map. And that creates a strong salinity gradient between a more saturated north arm and a less saline south arm on Great Salt Lake. There is a breach in that causeway that allows for bidirectional flow between the north and the south. And there is now an adaptive management berm in that breach that actually allows us to regulate that bidirectional flow and therefore also regulate the salinity and manage the salinity of the south arm of the lake, which is the primary Artemia resource. Next slide. So with the ability to manage salinity, then the question becomes, what are we doing about nutrient inflows and about nutrient modeling on Great Salt Lake? In Utah, it is the Division of Water Quality that is developing nutrient criteria to protect the beneficial uses of Utah waters, and that includes the Great Salt Lake. That division actually created an advisory team, and a technical team that guides that process and takes into account the needs of many of the stakeholders. And the Great Salt Lake Ecosystem Project is also working and studying nutrient inflows and more recently also nutrient cycling. And so we're seeing a lot of progress that's being made today in both the management of these nutrient inflows into the lake, but also the modeling of the nutrient dynamics in Great Salt Lake. And what we know today is that at least 90% of nutrients within the Great Salt Lake ecosystem are cycled between the different trophic levels of the lake. Next slide. So with salinity managed, nutrients under control, the question then begs, what are we doing about lake levels? And we know we are seeing problems with our lake levels today. The lake levels are decreasing. What we have learned on Great Salt Lake is that that decrease is, the reason for that decrease is the consumptive use of water. It's the use of water for agriculture and for development. And that has lowered lake levels by 3.6 meters over the last 150 to 200 years or so. And in fact, if it were not for that development, then the lake today would be at the same level, exactly the same level as it was in 1856, as shown on this graph with the blue line. Next slide. So we do have issues with water inflows, and the question then becomes, how are we dealing with that? Well, in 2010, the Utah legislature actually enacted by law the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council. It's a council that advises our governor and also advises several of our departments in Utah. And it advises those on sustainable use and development of Great Salt Lake. And today the council has focused a lot of efforts on water management, and that has already resulted in changes in water laws that actually allow to maintain water inflow into the lake, federal infrastructure investments to help preserve the Great Salt Lake ecosystem, And last but really not least, also, it has truly increased the public awareness about the importance of Great Salt Lake to Utah. Next slide. So what did it take to create the sustainable management of Great Salt Lake? Well, it took a real cooperative process with many of the stakeholders. It did start with our brine shrimp industry, working with the Division of Wildlife Resources, but that division is now studying many different aspects of the lake. It took the formation of the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council that's now really focused on water conservation and water strategy development. The work of the Division of Water Quality, focusing on standards for nutrients, the work of the Forestry, Fire, and State Lands Department that is focused on the management of salinity. And really, today, it's not just a brine shrimp industry, but many other stakeholders, industries, and organizations that are participating in this process. And really, I wouldn't do it justice if I didn't mention also all of the universities and research institutes that are supporting the research here on Great Salt Lake. Next slide, please. So then the question is, did we succeed in creating this sustainable management system? Well, the truth is that this is a very complex and a very dynamic system. There will for sure always be more work to be done. But with 2 decades now of scientific research and cooperative management, we can say that we have implemented a sustainable harvest management. We now have a tool to manage that salinity. We're confident that our nutrient inflows can be managed, and with salinity and nutrients being managed, we know that our Artemia population is shielded from significant water volume declines, contaminants are under control, and there is now a real focus on managing water inflows into the lake. And with that, I thank you very much for listening.